Hello everyone. So we're going to talk a little bit about Reconstruction. We're not going to be able to discuss everything in this short video, but please make sure you download and look through the notes section of the PowerPoint slides. Make sure you read through the chapter 16 in your textbook. There are going to be things in the textbook that are not in these slides, and vice versa. That's going to be the trend throughout the course, so make sure you're always checking through both. So just a little bit about Reconstruction. What does this term mean? So Reconstruction is a general term to talk about the period after the American Civil War. It's often the cutoff for these kind of survey courses because it is a huge turning point in American history. It goes from about 1865, the end of the Civil War, to 1877, which is the end of military Reconstruction in the South, which we'll talk about in a minute. For the most part, there are four main questions that are facing the American people after the end of the Civil War. The first is how to rebuild the South after its destruction during the Civil War. The South is in complete shambles after the Civil War. Most of its railroads have been destroyed. Most of its infrastructure was based off of agriculture. It was based off of slavery, and that's going to be destroyed. Most of the fields are in disarray. The entire upper echelon, so the president, of course, is tried for treason. Many of the high leaders are as well. So there's a lot that needs to be addressed in the South. Another question that the American public is going to have to answer is what would be the condition of African Americans after the Civil War? Are they going to be free? Are they going to be conditionally free? Are they going to be allowed to vote? Can they own land? Should we give them land? How do we set them up to be American citizens if we're going to make them citizens? All of these are questions that had to be answered right after the Civil War. And then the third question, how would the South be reintegrated into the Union? Remember, the South had created its own country. It was completely independent. Very similar to the North, it had a president, it had its armies, but it needs to be reintegrated into a union in a functional way in order for the country to move forward. And then the fourth and final question surrounding Reconstruction is who would be in control of these processes? Who is going to be in charge of determining how we readmit Southern states? Who's going to be in charge of determining how we handle freedom and slavery? Who's going to be in charge of rebuilding the South and all that goes into the financial woes of rebuilding? Is it going to be the Southern states themselves who are responsible for readmitting themselves, for policing themselves? Are we going to put all of this power behind the president and he makes the final decisions? Or is it going to be Congress? Maybe they should make all the decisions. Or should it be some combination of all of these things? So there are definitely a lot of questions and concerns at this point in history. And that's why it's often a cutoff. So one of the first things they address is that second question, what to do with slavery. Obviously, the 13th Amendment is passed. The 13th Amendment is the most famous one. It abolishes slavery. The problem, however, with the 13th Amendment is that it gives Congress the power to control this law, and it doesn't give Congress very clear guidelines. It's very kind of a wishy-washy law, if you want to use that terminology. The next thing Congress is going to do after it abolishes slavery is to try and figure out how to help freedmen. Freedmen are just all slaves who are now free because of that amendment. They, remember, were probably illiterate. There were laws against teaching them to read and write. They do not own anything. They don't own land. Oftentimes they don't even own the clothes on their back. And somehow they need to be integrated into society and be able to become productive citizens. So there is this society created, the Freedmen's Bureau, created specifically by Congress to try and bridge this gap. It's headed by General Oliver O. Howard, and the goal, or the grand scheme, of this bureau is to grant what becomes known as 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule is never actually granted to most of the African Americans, but the goal of the Freedmen's Bureau was to set up individual farms for each family by granting them 40 acres and one mule divvied out from southern lands that had been captured during the Civil War. For the most part, this plan fails. They're not able to divvy up land and hand it over to freedmen, but the Bureau itself is rather successful in helping them get jobs, helping establish schools, helping with education. So they are helpful, but they are eventually disbanded. They don't last very long. They only last until about 1872, and part of why they're disbanded is because of corruption within the Bureau, instances of bribery, violence, and it's just not able to achieve its goals. All right, so one of the first attempts to reconstruct is something known as the Presidential Reconstruction Plan. We're going to talk about 3 plans in the course of this. This is also known as the Lincoln Plan because it was President Lincoln's proposed Reconstruction plan for after the Civil War. He actually proposes this plan in 1863, so before the war has even ended, and it's called the 10% plan because it required at least 10% of a state's southern states voters to pledge allegiance to the United States, the Union, and to pledge to obey the 13th Amendment, emancipation. Once at least 10% voted to agree to those 2 clauses, then they were allowed to be readmitted into the Union. They were allowed to set up their own state government, and they would then be recognized as a state within the Union. This worked very well for many in Congress, except there is a strong opposition because the 10% mark is so low. There was a strong opposition by radical Republicans in the form of the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. The Wade-Davis Bill basically takes Lincoln's 10% plan and it ups that percentage from 10% to 50%. There was a strong fear among radical Republicans in Congress that if they allowed a state where only 10% of that state's population agreed to follow the Union, that they were admitting a big liability into the Union. They were admitting a state with potentially 90% of its citizens against the Union, and they saw this as too much of a risk. Lincoln is still alive at this point, so he vetoes the Wade-Davis bill. He says, it's too strong, it's not lenient enough, and the main goal of his 10% plan is a quick reunification of the country. So he completely vetoes this, it doesn't go into effect, but the tension between radical and conservative Republicans in Congress will continue, and we'll see that when we talk about military reconstruction in a second. Unfortunately, this kind of go-between, Lincoln as the mediator between conservative and radical Republicans, is completely destroyed when he is assassinated, Ford's Theater, April 14th, 1865. Once he is assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, will take over the presidency. Johnson will be lenient for the South. He is definitely a Southern sympathizer, and he will take Reconstruction in a new direction, creating his own plan for the post-Civil War Union. All right, so who is Johnson? Johnson is a champion of poor whites. He is against the planter aristocrats in the South, yet he himself is, of course, a slave owner. He's fairly wealthy. He refused to succeed with Tennessee, which is his own home state, in April of 1861, and he chose to remain in the Senate, which for his political career, this was a great decision. He served as the military governor of Tennessee, and when the Union was reconquered, as a state, he served as, of course, Lincoln's vice president for the Union Party in 1864. Unfortunately, he is probably one of the most overtly racist presidents we have ever had. Many of his policies are targeted at favoring the South, and often they undermine a lot of the radical Republican anti-slavery legislation that have been trying to get pushed through Congress. So he will create a lot of problems. Johnson did, for the most part, follow Lincoln's plan at first because it set such a low percentage. That 10% percentage is something he agreed with. He admitted several states under this 10% plan while Congress was not in session to avoid radical Republicans standing up against him. But in May of 1865, he chose to issue his own Reconstruction Proclamation, which is now known as the Restoration Plan or Johnson's Plan. If you hear those names, they're interchangeable, they mean the same thing. Overall, Johnson's plan disenfranchised certain leading Confederates. It granted many Confederates pardons. His plan, for the most part, was to call for state conventions. At these state conventions, he would ask the states to repeal their secession, to re-enter the Union, and he would, in exchange for that agreement, renounce all of their outstanding war debts. Because of pressure from Republican Congress, he is also forced to require the ratification of the 13th Amendment by these states in order to be readmitted. So this is something he didn't want to include in his state conventions, but is kind of forced to include by Congress. Once these states are readmitted, once these ex-Confederate leaders are pardoned and able to get back into the American political system, they start wreaking havoc, and they start kind of pushing back against the radical Republican plans in Congress. By participating in Congress, a lot of these new Southern political leaders could impact the 13th Amendment and how it was realized. Because remember, the 13th Amendment was given power by Congress, and Congress is given the power to enforce it. By allowing in these Southern leaders, the 13th Amendment is undermined, and by 1865, 1866, you have a lot of high officials who are starting to allow the creation of black codes. So what are black codes? Black codes are essentially laws. They are done by state. They are not national laws. They're state by state. Sometimes they even vary county by county. And they are laws intended to revert Southern laws, revert back to the old times, revert back to pre-Civil War standards, force slavery back on African Americans, even though the 13th Amendment has been ratified by that state. So they're trying to circumvent the abolition laws. Ultimately, Mr. Johnson will be impeached in 1867. Radical Republicans wanted Johnson out of office because he was creating so many problems for their Reconstruction plans. He will be voted out of office. He will be impeached for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. He had violated the Tenure of Office Act of 1867 when he tried to remove Senate-approved appointees. Basically, political ties, political canoodling got him impeached from office. All right, so once we've impeached Johnson, it opens the way for radical Republicans to take over Congress again and try and push out those Southern Democrats, those Southern ex-Confederate leaders that Johnson had allowed to kind of run amok. These new radical Republicans are led by Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, and their plan is not really to punish the South, but to try and limit white supremacy and limit what was going on in the South in terms of black codes. These new leaders proposed something called military Reconstruction in March of 1867 as a final Reconstruction plan to replace the Johnson plan. And it does exactly what it sounds like. Military Reconstruction is an act that was sent out to divide the South into 5 military districts. Each of these military districts would be commanded by a Union general, and it would be policed by the Union Army to ensure that the states followed the 13th and 14th, and then eventually the 15th Amendment. The goal for this radical military Reconstruction was to make sure that slaves were having access, freedmen, former slaves, were having access to things like jobs. They had access to vote. They had access to political office. Basically that their rights were being protected. Right, so there's obviously going to be some pushback. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, gets its start in Tennessee in 1865. It's a Southern pushback against radical Republicans. And its entire goal at this time period is to overthrow Reconstruction governments in the South and replace them with democratic governments. The goal is to basically return the South to pre-Civil War terms. Pre-Civil War leadership, a return to what was. In order to accomplish this, they start turning to violence, and this is what everyone remembers them for. Lynchings go through the roof, violence not only against freedmen, but also against Freedmen's Bureau leaders. If you are a radical Republican, even if you're white and you're in the South, you're probably going to get harassed by this organization at the time period. There is pushback. So the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871 are pushed back by Republicans, those in the North, to try and limit these acts of violence and limit the influence of the KKK. The acts, also known as the Enforcement Acts, send troops to try and limit the KKK's intimidation tactics. It's the first time the federal government has ever acted to protect individuals rather than using local authorities, because local authorities were corrupted. Unfortunately, it's not successful. So it's extremely hard to limit this violence because it is so widespread at the time. The KKK is really what contributes to the idea of the Solid South, or the South against the North. White Democrats are trying to take over the South in terms of leadership, in terms of government, social, cultural aspects, and make it its own solid voting bloc, and they're getting very good at doing that. All right, so a little bit more about black codes. Black codes are a huge part of the KKK's power. It's a huge intimidation tactic. It's very effective at limiting what African Americans are able to do, what freedmen can do, and it's very good at controlling who is in power, where, what they can do. So the black codes, again, are state codes or even county codes. They are often enforced with huge fines or even prison time on a chain gang. Their entire goal, again, is to regulate freedmen. So they're not allowed to go out past a certain time. They have to have special papers to move between town to town. They're only allowed to live in certain parts of the town. They're only allowed to take certain jobs. The other part of black codes was to kind of go back to their previous slave labor supply, make sure that they have a stable labor supply in the South. So again, restricting what types of jobs freedmen can take is a way to do that, making sure they can only do agricultural-based jobs. All right, so about this time is also when you have the passage of the 14th and the 15th Amendments. What these amendments do, and I have kind of listed their general outline of what they are. So the 14th Amendment gives civil rights, not citizenship, not voting. And then the 15th Amendment gives voting rights to African Americans. And really, this was a pushback against the black codes. It was radical Republicans in Congress trying to strengthen their influence, trying to strengthen the 13th Amendment by giving more rights to African Americans, to freedmen, as they could. They were trying to make sure the 13th Amendment could not be undone by Democrats. So the 14th Amendment gives civil rights in 1866, and the 15th Amendment, which also has a lot of loopholes, isn't that effective, gives the right to vote or suffrage in 1869. The problem is that there's a lot of loopholes. There's no way to really enforce these amendments at the time, and I'm sure you've heard of this term before. The grandfather clause pops up to make the 15th Amendment pretty much obsolete in many southern states. What the grandfather clause is in the name. So it basically says that if your grandfather could not vote, then you cannot vote. And since this is the first generation removed from slavery, none of their grandfathers could vote for the most part. Pretty much none of the freedmen can vote under these clauses either. All right, so the end of Reconstruction. It is really hard to put a clear end date on the end of Reconstruction. But for the most part, 1877 is usually the end date that's given because of the compromise in the 1877 election. By 1870, all of the southern states had been readmitted to the Union. The 14th and 15th Amendments had been adopted. But you still had some remnants of military presence in southern sections, southern states. In the end, the thing that ends Reconstruction is the compromise in this election. So there is a dispute between the presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Sam Tilden. So we all know that Hayes ultimately gets the presidency, but it's so close that they have to kind of go back, retally the votes, and come to a compromise to actually put him into the presidency. Hayes is a Republican, and he's really only chosen over the Democrat Sam Tilden because they come to a compromise. They basically say, well, the Democrats will allow Hayes, the Republican, to be elected as president if the Republicans agree to end military reconstruction. If they agree to remove all of the troops in the South and kind of sacrifice, so to speak, civil rights in the South in exchange for having Hayes, the Republican president. So that's ultimately what happens. Reconstruction in terms of civil rights is pretty much put on the chopping block in favor of this compromise and in favor of peace, at least for the time being. Presidential power dramatically declines. Congress starts to take over a lot of that power vacuum. And of course, because of that compromise, Union forces are completely removed in those 5 military districts in the South. Alright, so some of the post-Reconstruction civil rights struggles. We're going to talk a lot about these in later lectures, but just some things to be aware of. Basically, because of the failures of Reconstruction in terms of civil rights, you have a regression. In most cases, freedmen return to a sharecropping system where they're essentially slaves. They're like serfs tied to the land because of debt. They're required to take out debt in order to plant their crops. You know, they have to take out a loan in order to get the seeds and the equipment to plant. And once they do, they're going to end up in a cycle where they always owe money to the landowners. And they're tied into that land indefinitely. Lynchings become, again, very widespread. During the 1890s, 200 blacks were lynched per year, 4/5 of which in the South. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 kind of follows along with the 14th and 15th Amendment. It's lesser known. It pushes for civil rights. It again ultimately falls flat because it has way too many loopholes. But it made it a crime for any individual to deny full and equal access of public places. This is ultimately going to be overturned, and we know this because of Jim Crow laws, which allows segregation, and you start seeing signs like the one shown here, waiting room for colored only, or you'll see the drinking fountain signs for colored, for white, right next to each other. So the Jim Crow laws take over the South, and you have segregation. There is pushback. Booker T. Washington tries to create black normal schools, basically trade schools for African Americans, freedmen, to try and educate them and raise their status to a middle-class lifestyle. It sort of works. Plessy v. Ferguson is that case that officially sets up separate but equal. Again, there's also pushback by W.E.B. Du Bois. He is actually in opposition to Washington. He's far more direct. He wants immediate economic equality. He does not get that, but the Niagara movement does eventually grow into the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still around today and does have significant influence in later civil rights disagreements. Alright, so a really quick discussion about terms, because sometimes you'll see these terms in your textbook, you'll see them pop up in conversations, so I just want you to know what they mean in the context of Reconstruction. So scalawags was a term for Southern men. They were men who supported Reconstruction. So basically scalawags are Southern Republicans, which was a dirty word in the South. You didn't want to be a Republican in the South at this time period. Carpetbaggers are called that, and this is what you see in the picture. They're called that because supposedly they packed up everything they owned in a carpet bag in the North and moved to the South because of all of these new opportunities that were being presented in the South during Reconstruction. So they're generally resented by Southerners. They're seen as Northern Republicans who are coming seeking fortune off of the corruption or the downfall of the South. Redeemers? Redeemers are exactly what the name sounds like. These are Southern Democrats who want to redeem the glory of the South. They want to return to pre-Civil War times. They want the glory of nostalgia of the old times. And then Bourbons are ex-plantation owners. They are the previous aristocrats of the South. They still have some influence, but obviously a lot of their power is in the decline because of the 13th Amendment. But they still have some influence in the South. All right, so most of what I've talked about sounds bad. This starts out as a great triumph for the civil rights movement. You know, you have the Freedmen's Bureau and you have radical Republicans, and we're going to rebuild the South in a great way. And then it declines once Johnson takes office, and it just declines further from there when you get black codes and other legal conundrums. But it isn't all bad. Education does improve. Former slaves are taught to read and write. They're very, very eager to learn to read and write, and the Freedmen's Bureau works hard to educate these new young men and women. Taxes, so a new tax system is created. Taxes are improved because the entire country has to pay to rebuild. They, of course, need money for that. Public works projects means that there's a lot of jobs for people. They're able to rebuild the railroad systems, make improvements in that process. Public offices, so public offices are kind of streamlined. It becomes more of a merit-based system than just a handout. And there are amendments passed, so even though the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments do have their problems, they certainly have loopholes, and they can certainly be improved upon, they are passed. Slavery is abolished. We do establish citizenship. We establish suffrage, male suffrage. Women, I'm sorry, you have to wait. But we are moving in a good direction. It's just we've taken a couple steps back from where we initially were headed. All right, so some questions to consider. At the end of this, these are some of the critical thinking questions. So can you discuss the North, who won the North? Who won this? Who won this? If the North won the Civil War, did the South win Reconstruction? Is that a valid statement? Why or why not? To what extent did Reconstruction constitute a political, economic, and social revolution in the South between 1865 and 1877? And to what extent were Republicans successful in achieving their Reconstruction goals between 1865 and 1877? And remember, Republicans are those of the North.